Hello plant lovers and happy new year. It's 2021 and as the song says, things can only get better. And to that end, today we are going to talk about this beauty of a little Dendrobium. Dendrobium loddigesii, I think is how you pronounce it. Do forgive me because Latin names aren't my strong point. Now a quick caveat. I have been away and so unfortunately have missed most of the flowers, but you can see there are still a few blooms here and they do last quite a long time. But it is such a pretty orchid, and plant lovers, I'm here to tell you, so easy to grow. So let's get to details. Firstly, it is a small species, and this is a species orchid, so this is as it occurs in the wild, which means it's also quite useful to research where it comes from and try and replicate its conditions there. However, as you can see, the canes aren't particularly tall and it's probably not going to get that much bigger. It does get quite bushy. I've seen pictures of larger specimens and it is quite a bushy number with lots of keikis. Now, I'll come in closer and show you. This one has been producing lots of keikis for years, and I always thought it was just sort of mismanagement on my behalf, but in fact the images I've seen of larger specimens, it does tend to do that, so I'm now not going to be that worried about its proclivity to produce keikis. Now its native range is parts of eastern and southern China, Laos and Vietnam, and it grows at quite high altitudes, and it is described as both an epiphyte, a lithophyte and terrestrial. So this orchid is opportunistic, but it does grow in damp mossy forests which are wet in spring and summer but dry in winter, and that is the essence to the care of this orchid. So first things first, like many Dendrobium, it needs a winter rest, and that means little or no water, no fertilizer, but plenty of filtered indirect sunlight. If not, a little bit of direct morning sun, which is what this one gets. Now I am in Melbourne, which I will show you here. We are in southeastern Australia, and the climate in Melbourne is described as cool temperate, which covers a multitude of sins, but it's the equivalent roughly to a zone 10 in the USA, and if you're lucky, parts of southeast England. Essentially though, we don't have freezing winters, and we can have very hot, quite dry summers. And this baby sits outdoors all year, because it is described as a cold growing orchid, which means it can take this kind of weather, which is perfect. So this orchid is in fact perfect for my climate here in Melbourne. Okay, so the basics. Temperature. It is a cool to cold growing orchid, and it does need a cold winter period to actually set the blooms. So you do need to be somewhere like Melbourne, which has cold winters that don't freeze. Now, I've never tested it below freezing. On very cold nights in Melbourne, it can get pretty low. It can get down to about 2 degrees Celsius, which is about, what is that, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty damn cold. And this sits outside all year. It is undercover, it is protected, so it doesn't get rained on, and that's the thing. But firstly, it needs a cold winter to stimulate flowers. Water, second point. Okay, in winter, again, you need to keep it on the dry side. So with this baby being kept outside, I make sure that it's under cover and it doesn't get rained on, because you don't want it to be soggy and wet in winter. But because I can't stand the cruelty of denying anyone a drink, I do water it occasionally in winter. So I don't let it completely dry out, but I do keep it much more on the drier side than you would normally. The flower buds will start to form late winter, early spring, and that's when you start gently increasing the water levels and a little bit of fertilizer as well. Now with fertilizer, I put literally a couple of grains of slow release fertilizer into the medium, and then during the growing season, late spring, summer, I give it maybe once every 2 weeks a very diluted solution of a seaweed based liquid fertilizer, and I dilute that to about 1/8 of the recommended dose on the bottle. But you can kind of do whatever you want really, but just don't give it a really strong mix. And so light, yes, like many Dendrobiums, it is going to need strong light in winter as well as the cold to stimulate the flower buds, and then dappled light. So if you imagine it's growing in these leafy forests in parts of Southeast Asia, it's going to get more sun penetration in winter and more covered light in summer. So you sort of need to replicate that. And I have read that this doesn't do well indoors, which is not great news for those of you who are in climates that are colder or hotter than Melbourne. But look, with all things, give it a go and see what happens. Medium wise, as it is a lithophyte, epiphyte, terrestrial, I just use my pretty basic orchid mix, which is orchid bark with a little bit of charcoal and a little bit of perlite, and just in this case a hint of sphagnum moss, just to keep the moisture in there during the spring and summer periods. My secret ingredient in the mix is always a tiny little sprinkle of mycorrhizal fungi, which is the powder you can get online from most suppliers, which stimulates positive root fungus growth, which helps the plant develop healthy roots, but also draw out nutrients from the medium and from the fertilizer that you might put in there. As you can see, this example is now probably 3 years old, and I bought it as a seedling, but it grows pretty quickly. I have put it in a terracotta pot because, yes, plant lovers, I'm a terracotta pot kind of guy. But essentially, it doesn't matter as long as the pot is free draining. As I have said though before, terracotta does evaporate water very quickly, which creates a bit of humidity and also prevents the orchid roots from sitting in wet stodge. So I just like them, and I like them aesthetically, but you can do whatever you want with the pot. And as you can see, the flower period is coming to an end. So it is midsummer in Australia. The flowers for me always tend to come in December before Christmas and then start to fade. And at about the same time, you start to see all the new shoots coming along, which obviously you need to promote because the flowers do come from last year's mature canes. But as you can see, and I'll come in and show you closer, the older canes are still alive, but they can become a little deciduous, and you can still get flower buds from those. So, as with most dendrobiums, don't cut off any canes until it is absolutely dry and dead. Just leave it, because you never know what it might produce. Now, I have heard this described as fragrant, but plant lovers, alas, I'm here to tell you, I can smell nothing, and I have a good nose. But look, that might just be my example, who knows? I've seen images of this as a bigger, older specimen with beautiful pendulous canes covered in bloom. So I'm looking forward to this growing. Again, for me, in this rental, it's a little hard to give it the perfect environment. So hopefully when we move into our new home, I can give Dendrobium loddigesii the environment that it was born to flourish in. Now, perhaps you can see, I'll come in closely, but the flower buds form on the opposite side of the cane to the leaf, which is pretty common for most dendrobiums. And each of those little buds will produce one flower. And last year when this bloomed, each of the canes was covered in flowers. I had a much better display because I was able to give it better conditions in winter. However, all's well, and next year I can give it much better love, I'm sure. There we are, plant lovers. I bought this as a seedling. It grows incredibly quickly, so don't be put off by experimenting with a seedling. Also, it can be cost effective if you're not sure that it's going to thrive in your environment. Buying a seedling is a good way to test the waters. Now, I've never grown this indoors, and I have read that it doesn't bloom that well indoors. Who knows? I can't talk to that. If you buy a seedling and you experiment, then you know the loss isn't going to be too great. But if you have a climate like mine, then it will thrive outdoors all year. I've also grown this on a city balcony in a dappled covered condition, and it loved it and produced tons of flowers. So there you go. Give it a good Aussie go. Dendrobium loddigesii, a lovely small dendrobium orchid that you should give a go if you can find it and you've got the right conditions for it. An easy one to grow, an easy one to bloom, and really quite tough. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing if you so desire, and thank you for asking a question which I might not be able to answer because I am an amateur, stumbling my way through the fields of orchid and unusual plant growing here in Melbourne. But nonetheless, thank you for watching, and I will hopefully see you next week with something else equally as interesting. Until then, plant lovers, take care.